All right, in Unit 3, we're going to explore how best to study the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Now, this first video will cover both lessons 1 and 2, so it'll be a little bit longer, and you may choose to watch it as a whole or break it up in half or whatever. Many of the materials in the Bible, particularly the early parts and the historical parts, involve stories. And of course, the best example of this is Genesis. Genesis is all stories. But it's important for us to understand how to explain these stories. How do they work? How are they different from stories that you may read today? Because the Hebrew writers had a unique approach to storytelling, and we need to understand that to appreciate the stories. The first thing to keep in mind is they like to tell stories using an element we call brevity, short. Think about it, the entire creation story from beginning until the creation of humans is only about 31 verses. It's one chapter basically of Genesis. How can you tell the whole creation story in such a short space of time? But this is true with almost every other story as well. They're short, and that is very important to understand Hebrew stories. They don't drag you through an entire novel of reversals and suspense and whatever. No, they finish very quickly. A second element of Hebrew stories is they're unemotional. A good example of this is Genesis 22. God comes to Abraham. Abraham, take your son Isaac, whom you love, go sacrifice him on Mount Moriah. Next thing we read, Abraham saddled his donkey, took his son and 2 other young men, carried some wood, went to Mount Moriah to sacrifice him. Was it that simple? Did Abraham feel nothing? What happened to his emotional trauma? I've been a father. I am a father. Someday you all will be fathers. Boys and girls will be mothers. How would you feel if this command was given to you? Would you be arguing with God? Would you be debating? Would you say, no, this is not fair. God, I cannot do this. I'm sure that Abraham had his emotional struggle, but the story doesn't tell us about those emotional struggles. Third element of Hebrews narrative or storytelling in the Hebrew Bible is rapid movement of events. You don't prolong into this extended descriptive element of storytelling that we find in English stories. So in that same story of Abraham, God made a command, Abraham obeyed a command, they arrived at Moriah. In just a few verses, they've gotten from here to here. If we were writing that story today in English, we'd probably be a whole book before we get there. And so the stories move very quickly. They don't waste time with emotions, they don't waste time with descriptions, just basic facts. Element number 4, and this is the difficult one, it's called narrative silence. Tells us a lot of things and keeps from us a lot of things. So coming back to that story of Abraham, Sarah, who's the mother of Isaac, she has only one son, and she waited her whole life. When it was almost impossible, then she had the son. She is not mentioned in the story. She is completely out of the story as if she isn't there. She was still very much alive. And you have to wonder why the absence. Sarah is very active in all the Abraham stories, except this one. This is the most important story, but she's nowhere to be found. This is what we call narrative silence. Its apparent purpose is to force the reader to figure things out or to enter the story. What would you do if you were Sarah? Or women, girls who are watching this, what would you do if you were Abraham's wife? Do you think Abraham had to hide the fact from her and so keep her out of the story so she doesn't get on the way? Who knows? Okay. Stories also have twists and reversals. Abraham thought he was going to sacrifice his son. When they get to the top of Mount Moriah, he discovers that God had prepared an actual sacrifice, a ram stuck in the bushes. Isaac was just a test to see if Abraham loved God more than his son and how far he would go to fulfill that command of God. All right? Maybe the last and most important element of biblical storytelling, they don't give us moralistic judgment of the characters. They don't tell us he's good, he's bad, what he did was wrong, what he did was right. They just simply tell what happened. This is God's command. This is what Abraham did. There is no judgment about was it right for Abraham to even think of sacrificing his son. No. They're not interested in that. Just tell what the story really is. And this is why there are so many stories in the Bible. Using this ability to write stories in this way means that they can pack more stories into the Hebrew Bible than we normally would pack in a book. And so that's the art of Hebrew narrative. And I hope that you will come to terms with it so you can get a better understanding of how those stories work and know the Bible stories better for yourself. In this lesson, we are looking at Hebrew songs, or maybe to be more specific, Hebrew poetry. But, there are lots of songs as well, and there's an entire book of songs called the Psalms. Now, to understand Hebrew poetry and therefore Hebrew songs, we must understand the simple principle of how Hebrew poetry works, and that is parallelism. Parallelism is the idea that you have 2 lines, 3 lines, sometimes many lines, that work together as a group. There are a few common types, and so I will try and explain those to you. What I've done is to get 2 chopsticks to explain these parallelisms. Okay, so here's chopstick 1, chopstick 2. Now, if the 2 chopsticks are running in the same direction, we say that they are synonymous parallelism. Now, this is line 1, this is line 2 of the poem, and notice the ends of they're moving in the same direction. Okay, that means that they have the same thought. All parallel lines have the same thought. So you have to look at both lines to get the complete thought. You can't look only at one line and ignore the second line because you will miss the thought. And in the case of synonymous parallelism, it is important to realize that the 2 lines are equal, okay, and they are moving together as a pair. That is synonymous. But sometimes you have the opposite happen, where one line is running this way and a second line comes and runs in the opposite direction. This is called antithetical parallelism. They are still a pair, they still have to be understood together, and this one is easy to see even in English because it will often, the second line will begin with but. A good son is like, but a bad son is like. So, antithetical parallelism. Okay. You also have what is called staircase parallelism. Okay, this is where you have 2 lines, 3 lines, and they form a kind of staircase. It's like climbing up 1, 2, 3. And usually they will begin with the same word in each line and then add a different thought. A more technical name for it is anadiplosis. Then you have a very special one which seems unique to the Bible. It's called chiastic. Chiastic parallelism is where you have 2 lines. If there are more than 2 lines, we call it concentric. And one line is running this way, and then the other line comes and crosses it, making the shape of an X. That's where the word chiastic comes from the Greek term for the letter X. They are a pair, the thoughts are the same, but notice the end. This one is similar to this one is similar to this. Okay? Or sometimes this is running this way, and this one is running the other way. And so you have, this would be point A and point B, this would be point B, the next point B and point A. This is very unique construction, chiastic. Think of it like an X, where one line goes this way and one line crosses it. And that is what we call chiastic parallelism. There is no English word for it. And so that is the word that you will have to learn. Let me tell you one more. This is what we call an envelope or inclusio. In this one, you have two lines at the beginning and at the end of the song, and many items in between them, just like an envelope. You put a letter inside. And you could have one item between them, you could have two, you could have four, you could have six, you could have an entire song in between. But the first line and the last line is the same. Psalm 150, praise or hallelujah is the first line. The last line is hallelujah as well. The important thing to remember about these parallel lines is that they all are a pair. They are a unit. You cannot break them up in order to understand them. But once you get the hang of it, then you will enjoy the poetry, and I hope you will enjoy the songs of the Hebrew Bible. Another form of communication in the Hebrew Bible is what we call prophecy. There are different types of prophecies. Prophecies dealing with the present, prophecies dealing with the future, prophecies dealing with the end of the world. Now, the Bible prophecies are unique. They have special uses of numbers, special uses of colors, special symbols, and each prophet has his own way of communicating. What is important, though, is this, that the prophet and his writing, his prophecy, must be one and the same thing. So the man who would write the prophecies down, he has to live that prophecy. And many times they actually have to act it out, almost like actors, in order to show people how their prophecy is working. Prophecy is God's communication. The men and women who did this job were known as Nabi. And the word Nabi is translated as prophet. The same word exists in Arabic and it's used in Islam. But in Hebrew Bible, Nabi means the mouthpiece of God. So God is the actual speaker. The prophet is just the mouthpiece. And so they would often identify their message as, this is what God says. This is the declaration of Yahweh. As the Lord has spoken. That's a prophecy. Now, some prophecies are descriptive because they're dealing with the present. Some are predictive because they're dealing with the future. Some are involved with time. Some have nothing to do with time. Most prophecies are written in poetry, and it's important to understand both poetry in order to understand the prophecies. It's also important to remember the special elements that are involved in prophecy. And when you do that, then the prophecies begin to come alive. You can see them fulfilled. You can see them still waiting fulfillment. And so, since there are a lot of books dealing with prophecies, an entire collection of some 16 books, we need to come to terms with this form of writing as well. And you will discover the messages of God in them. In this lesson, we will learn about what is called close reading. This is a term that has been borrowed into biblical studies from literature. Close reading means that you look at every detail, at everything that is recorded, and even try to imagine what is not being recorded, why it's not recorded. This is where you have to read, to put it in another way, every word. Most of us tend to scan read. Our eyes follow the important things. But here you have to read carefully. It's not just being careful, it's about being meticulous. So every detail, don't ignore anything. You may say to yourself, but this is just giving us a date. This is just giving us a list of names. No, every detail is important. For example, in the story of Abraham, there is a little detail that is easy to miss, and that is Abraham was asked by God to take only his son Isaac. But Abraham took 2 other young men about Isaac's age with him. And then we need to know, why is this detail here? What is the point of the 2 young men? He had a donkey to carry the wood and the supplies, So why did he need the two young men? Is it possible that he is hoping one of them could be offered a sacrifice instead of his son? Who knows what was going through his mind? But it's an important piece of detail. But only when you read closely, carefully, meticulously, then you will understand. So read every detail, read everything that is recorded, and even try to imagine what is not recorded, why it is not being recorded. When you do that, then the Bible is easier to understand in many ways. Another skill we need when we're studying the Bible is what we call contextual reading. This is different from close reading. Close reading is to focus on that passage and every detail. Contextual reading is to look at what comes before. Let's say you're reading this passage in the middle. What comes before that? What comes after that? How is this connected with this? How is this connected with this? How is this and this one connected? And when you see all the connections, the line between those different pieces, then you have what we call contextual reading. And the reason for this is quite simple. Every Bible verse is part of a set of verses. Sometimes it involves a whole chapter, sometimes it involves a whole book, sometimes you may have to go through the whole Bible. You cannot understand a Bible verse by reading it alone, or what we say, reading in isolation. They were not written that way. They were written as part of a text. It's just like reading a book today. You know, there are some people who like to go to the end because they just want to know what happens at the end. But to really enjoy the book, you need to read everything. And if you had to stop a book somewhere halfway, when you come back, you want to remember what happened before that led to the story. And then ultimately, what happens afterwards? Where does the story? You are children of television, Netflix children. Do you know why TV series, Netflix series are so successful? Because of this contextual reading. And so you watch one episode, you want to know what happens next. But if you happen to come in on the third episode, then you want to go back to see what happened in first episode. I've done this, you've probably done this as well, and maybe many times, and you'll continue to do it. We want to know what happened before, what happened after, and how all these things are connected to each other. And so that is contextual reading. If this is your passage, you want to know what happened in front and what happened after it. When you do that, you get a more complete understanding of every verse and every passage in the Bible. We do not have a separate video for Lesson 8 because Lesson 8 is a practice lesson. So you really need the worksheets in order to do that. But we have one more skill. And this is a skill that you see every day on the television without even thinking about it. You will learn about it in journalism classes and so on. It's what we call reporters' questions. When you're reading the Bible, think of yourself as a news reporter, a television reporter, and you're trying to report the story of Abraham. But you need to know everything about that story if your report is to be factual. Otherwise, you will be making up a report. And these days, most good news website will do what is called a fact check when a report comes in to make sure that it's got all the facts correct. So what are the reporter's questions? Well, they're quite simple. They go something like this: who, what, where, when, how, why. So you're looking at the story of Abraham. You want to ask yourself, who is involved in this story? Well, God is involved, Abraham is involved, Isaac is involved, Sarah was not involved. Okay, that's the who. What is the story about? Well, the story is about a command of God to sacrifice Isaac. Where did this happen? The story tells us where it was, or more importantly, where the sacrifice is supposed to happen, Mount Moriah. When did this take place? Well, it took place long after Isaac was born, and he was now a grown man, not a child anymore. So we don't know exactly, but Abraham would have been about 125, and Isaac would have been about 25 years of age. How did it happen? Well, it happened because God asked Abraham and gave specific commands about where to go, what to do, and how to make the sacrifice. Why did it happen? The story begins with that question. It says that God tested Abraham. That's the why. And so when you apply the reporter's questions, you get this big picture about any passage, any story in the Bible, any song, any prophecy. And when you have that big picture, then your interpretation is far more accurate. That's what good reporters do. That's the difference between the good reporters and the fake reporters, between true news and fake news. You know all these terms today. And so practice. In Lesson 8 worksheets, you can practice all of these skills that you learn here in this unit and show that you can really understand the Bible in a larger way. Have fun.